The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floors of Kensington Palace as Princess Charlotte walked slowly through the corridor she had known since childhood. Her small footsteps echoed in the vast hallway, each sound seeming to bounce off the ancient walls that had witnessed centuries of royal drama. At just 8 years old, Charlotte carried herself with the poise expected of a future queen, but today something was different. Her usual bright smile was nowhere to be seen, and her eyes held a sadness that seemed far too heavy for someone so young. Captain James Harrison had been serving as a royal guard for nearly 15 years. He had protected 3 generations of the royal family, and, in all his time of service, he had never questioned a direct order from a senior royal. His loyalty was absolute, his duty sacred. Standing at 6 feet 4 inches with broad shoulders and kind brown eyes, James was known throughout the palace as both a formidable protector and a gentle soul who always had a warm smile for the younger royals. Princess Charlotte had grown particularly fond of him over the years, often stopping to chat about her school day or share excitement about an upcoming event. This morning felt different from the moment James arrived for his shift. There was tension in the air that he couldn't quite place. Staff members whispered in corners, their conversations stopping abruptly when anyone approached. The usual cheerful atmosphere of the palace seemed muted, as if everyone was walking on eggshells. James noticed that several senior staff members avoided eye contact, and even the kitchen staff, normally full of laughter and chatter, worked in unusual silence. Queen Camilla had requested an early meeting with the security team, which was unusual but not unheard of. James and 3 other guards stood at attention in the ornate meeting room, their uniforms pressed to perfection, their faces showing the professional composure expected of royal protection officers. Camilla entered the room with her usual regal bearing, but James noticed something in her expression that made him uneasy. There was a coldness there that he had rarely seen, a determination that spoke of difficult decisions already made. "Gentlemen," Camilla began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had grown comfortable with power over the years. "I have a matter of utmost importance to discuss with you. Recent events have made it necessary for us to take certain protective measures regarding Princess Charlotte." She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "There have been concerns raised about the princess's welfare and certain influences that may not be in her best interest." James felt his stomach tighten. In all his years of service, he had never known Princess Charlotte to be anything other than a delightful, well-behaved child who brought joy to everyone around her. The idea that she might be in some kind of danger or under negative influences seemed impossible to believe. He glanced at his fellow guards, noting the same confusion in their eyes that he felt in his heart. "The decision has been made," Camilla continued, her tone becoming more formal, "that Princess Charlotte needs to be temporarily detained for her own protection. She will be confined to the east wing of the palace until further notice. No visitors will be permitted, and she is not to leave her quarters under any circumstances." The silence in the room was deafening. James felt his training kick in, the automatic response to follow orders without question, but something deep inside him rebelled against what he was hearing. "Your Majesty," James found himself saying before he could stop himself, "might I ask what specific threat has been identified?" "Princess Charlotte seemed perfectly normal this morning when I saw her in the corridor." His voice remained respectful, but there was a questioning tone that hadn't been there moments before. Camilla's eyes narrowed slightly, and James could see displeasure flash across her features. "Captain Harrison, you are not required to understand the reasoning behind royal decisions. Your job is to follow orders, not to question them." Her voice had taken on a sharper edge, and James felt the weight of her authority pressing down on him. "Princess Charlotte is to be escorted to the East Wing immediately and confined there until I personally give the order for her release." "Is that understood?" The other guards nodded immediately, their training overriding any personal feelings they might have had about the situation. But James stood frozen, his mind racing. He thought about Princess Charlotte's face that morning, the sadness in her eyes that now made terrible sense. Had she somehow known this was coming? Had she been living in fear of this moment? The thought made his chest tight with anger and protective instinct. "Captain Harrison?" Camilla's voice cut through his thoughts like a blade. "I asked if you understood your orders." James looked at her, seeing not just the queen consort but a woman who seemed determined to use her power in a way that felt fundamentally wrong. He thought about his oath of service, about the promise he had made to protect the royal family from all threats.
But what happened when the threat came from within?
Yes, Your Majesty, James replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart.
I understand the order.
But, even as he spoke the words, he knew that understanding an order and agreeing with it were two very different things. Camilla nodded curtly and dismissed them, but not before fixing James with a look that told him she had noticed his hesitation. As they left the meeting room, James walked in silence with his fellow guards. The weight of what they had been asked to do pressed down on all of them, but it seemed that he was the only one struggling with the moral implications. When they reached the corridor where Princess Charlotte was likely to be found, James felt his heart begin to race. How could he look into the eyes of a child he had sworn to protect and, then, become her jailer? They found Princess Charlotte in the library, sitting in a large leather chair that seemed to swallow her small frame. She was reading a book about horses, her favorite subject, but James could see that she wasn't really focusing on the pages. When she looked up and saw the 4 guards approaching, her face went pale, and James saw fear flash in her young eyes. It was a look that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Hello, Princess Charlotte," James said softly, his usual warm tone intact despite the circumstances.
"We need to escort you to the east wing of the palace."
Charlotte's book slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud. She looked at James with such trust and confusion that he felt his heart breaking into pieces.
"Did I do something wrong, Captain Harrison?" she asked in a small voice that trembled with uncertainty. "Is Papa angry with me?"
The innocence in her question hit James like a physical blow. Here was a child who couldn't even imagine what offense she might have committed, asking if her father was displeased with her. The injustice of it all made James's hands clench into fists at his sides. "No, Princess," James replied gently, kneeling down so he was at her eye level.
"You haven't done anything wrong at all. This is just a temporary arrangement for your safety."
Even as he spoke the words, they felt like lies in his mouth. He was betraying everything he believed in by participating in this charade, but what choice did he have? To refuse a direct order from the Queen Consort would mean the end of his career, his pension, everything he had worked for over 15 years. As they walked toward the east wing, Charlotte's small hand slipped into James's large one. The gesture was so trusting, so innocent, that James felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. She was looking to him for protection and comfort, not realizing that he was part of the machinery that was taking away her freedom. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly before them, each step taking them further from everything Charlotte knew and loved. The east wing of the palace was beautiful but isolated, far from the main family quarters where Charlotte usually stayed. The rooms were well appointed but felt cold and unwelcoming, more like a luxury prison than a safe haven. As they reached the door to what would become Charlotte's temporary quarters, James felt a moment of clarity wash over him. He realized that this moment would define not just his career, but his character.
Would he be remembered as the man who blindly followed orders, or as someone who stood up for what was right when it mattered most?
"Princess Charlotte," James said suddenly, stopping just outside the door. His fellow guards looked at him in surprise, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Charlotte looked up at him with those trusting eyes, waiting for whatever he had to say.
James took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would change everything.
The weight of his decision pressed down on him as he looked at this innocent child who had done nothing wrong except exist in a complicated family dynamic. In that moment, James Harrison realized that true loyalty sometimes meant disobeying orders, and that protecting the royal family might require protecting them from each other. The question that had been building in his mind since the moment Camilla gave her order was about to be spoken aloud, and there would be no taking it back once the words left his lips. The silence in the corridor stretched like a taut wire as James Harrison stood at the threshold of Princess Charlotte's assigned quarters. His fellow guards shifted uncomfortably behind him, sensing the internal struggle playing out in their captain's mind. The ornate door before them might as well have been the entrance to a dungeon, for all the freedom it would offer the young princess. James could feel Charlotte's small hand trembling in his, and that tiny tremor seemed to vibrate through his entire being, shaking loose every assumption he had ever made about duty and loyalty. "Your Majesty, with respect," James said finally, turning to address the empty space where Queen Camilla should have been. but speaking loudly enough that his words would carry down the hallway to anyone who might be listening. "I have served this family faithfully for 15 years. I have never questioned an order, never hesitated in my duty, and never put my personal feelings above my obligations to the crown." His voice grew stronger with each word, and Charlotte looked up at him with growing curiosity, sensing that something important was happening. Guard Thompson, one of James's longtime colleagues, stepped forward nervously.
"Harrison, what are you doing? We have our orders."
But James held up his free hand, his attention focused entirely on the little girl whose future hung in the balance. The weight of royal tradition pressed down on them all, generations of unquestioned obedience to authority, but James felt something newer and more powerful rising within him, something that had to do with basic human decency. "Princess Charlotte," James said, his voice gentle but filled with resolve, "before I follow this order, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth."
Charlotte nodded seriously, her young face showing a maturity that no 8-year-old should have to possess. "Are you afraid right now?"
The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything the royal system represented. Charlotte's lower lip quivered slightly before she answered.
"Yes, Captain Harrison. I'm very afraid.
I don't understand what's happening, and nobody will explain it to me.
Camilla just said that I needed to be kept safe, but safe from what? I've been good, I've done all my lessons, I've been polite to everyone."
Her voice cracked on the last words, and James felt his resolve harden into something unbreakable.
"From your own father?" James asked quietly, kneeling down again so they were eye to eye. "Are you afraid of King William? Has he ever done anything to make you feel unsafe?"
Charlotte's eyes widened in surprise at the suggestion, and she shook her head vigorously.
"Papa would never hurt me," she said with absolute certainty.
"He loves me and George and Louis so much.
He tells us every day.
He reads us stories and plays games with us when he's not working." The conviction in her voice told James everything he needed to know about the true nature of this situation. This wasn't about protecting Charlotte from her father, this was about something else entirely.
Guard Wilson cleared his throat nervously. "Captain, we really should proceed with our orders. Queen Camilla was very clear about the urgency of this matter."
But James remained focused on Charlotte, his mind working through the implications of what he was learning.
If Charlotte wasn't afraid of her father, and if she had done nothing wrong, then what was the real reason for this detention? "Princess, has anyone talked to you about your mama lately?" James asked gently, referring to Catherine, Princess of Wales.
Charlotte's face brightened immediately at the mention of her mother, and James saw both love and longing in her expression. "Mama's been away visiting the hospitals and schools, but she calls us every night before bed. She tells us about all the people she meets and how brave they are. She says she misses us terribly but that her work is important too." Charlotte's voice carried the innocent pride of a child who loved her mother deeply. "Camilla says Mama fills our heads with silly ideas about helping people, but I don't think helping people is silly at all." The pieces began falling into place in James's mind. He remembered the recent tensions within the royal family, the subtle but growing divide between different approaches to royal duty. Catherine's popularity with the public had been soaring, her compassionate approach to royal service resonating with people in a way that seemed to make others in the family uncomfortable. Was Charlotte being punished for her mother's success? Was this detention really about preventing a young girl from being influenced by her own mother's values? "What kinds of things does your mama teach you?" James asked, his voice carefully neutral despite the anger building in his chest. Charlotte's face lit up as she began to share. "Mama teaches us that being royal means helping people who can't help themselves. She says we have to be kind to everyone, even people who are different from us. She shows us pictures of children who don't have enough food or safe places to live, and she explains how we can help make their lives better." Charlotte paused, her brow furrowing slightly. "Camilla says those things aren't our responsibility, but Mama says they are. I don't know who's right." James felt his heart swell with admiration for Catherine's parenting and simultaneous outrage at what Camilla was trying to do. This wasn't about protecting Charlotte, this was about controlling her, about cutting off her connection to values that apparently threatened someone's vision of what the royal family should represent. The thought of this innocent child being used as a pawn in adult power games made James's jaw clench with fury. "Captain Harrison," Guard Thompson said more urgently, "we're going to be in serious trouble if we don't follow through on this order." Queen Camilla specifically said no delays. But James stood up slowly, his decision crystallizing with each passing moment. "Tell me, Princess Charlotte," James said, his voice carrying new authority, "if you could choose right now, would you rather stay here in these rooms by yourself, or would you rather go find your papa and tell him what's happening?" The question was simple, but James knew the answer would determine everything that happened next. "I want papa," Charlotte said immediately, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I want to go home to my room where I can see my pictures of mama and where my books are arranged the way I like them. I want to have tea with George and Louis and tell them about what I learned in school today." The raw honesty of her words cut through every protocol and procedure that stood between a child and her father. James made his choice in that moment, a choice that would echo through the halls of power for years to come. He reached down and picked up Princess Charlotte, settling her securely in his arms the way he had done countless times when she was smaller. She wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face against his shoulder, and James could feel her small body relaxing for the first time since this ordeal began. "Where are you going?" Guard Wilson demanded as James turned away from the door to Charlotte's prison. "You can't just ignore a direct order from the Queen Consort. This is insubordination. This is treason." The words were heavy with threat and consequence, but James found that he didn't care about any of that anymore. "I'm taking Princess Charlotte to see her father," James said simply. "A child who has done nothing wrong doesn't deserve to be locked away from her family based on the paranoid fears of someone who clearly has her own agenda." His words were treasonous by royal standards, but they felt like the most honest thing he had said in years. As they walked back through the corridors toward the main family quarters, James could hear his fellow guards whispering urgently behind him. He knew they were probably calling for backup, reporting his insubordination to their superiors, setting in motion a chain of events that would likely end his career. But, with each step, he felt lighter, as if a tremendous weight was being lifted from his shoulders. Charlotte raised her head from his shoulder and looked at him with eyes that held more gratitude than any child should have to feel toward the adult who was supposed to be protecting her all along. "Captain Harrison," she whispered, "are you going to get in trouble for helping me?" The concern in her voice for his welfare, even in the midst of her own fear, confirmed everything James believed about the kind of person she was becoming under her parents' guidance. "Maybe, Princess," James replied honestly, "but sometimes doing the right thing is more important than avoiding trouble." "Your mama taught you that, didn't she?" Charlotte nodded against his shoulder, and James felt a surge of protective determination that surprised him with its intensity. This child represented the best of what the royal family could be, the hope for a more compassionate and genuine future, and he would not let that light be extinguished by political machinations and personal jealousies. The massive double doors to King William's private study came into view ahead of them, guarded by two more royal protection officers who looked up in surprise as James approached with Princess Charlotte in his arms. James could see the confusion in their faces as they tried to process what they were seeing. By all rights, Charlotte should have been secured in the East Wing by now, not being carried through the palace by a guard who was clearly operating outside his orders. "I need to see His Majesty immediately," James announced as they reached the doors. "Princess Charlotte needs to speak with her father." The guards exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unsure how to handle a situation that fell far outside normal protocol. James could hear footsteps approaching rapidly from behind them, probably his fellow guards coming to stop him, but he was committed now to seeing this through to the end. The ornate doors to King William's private study seemed to tower above them as James Harrison stood with Princess Charlotte still secure in his arms. The two guards flanking the entrance wore expressions of complete bewilderment, their training providing no guidance for a situation where a senior protection officer was directly defying orders from the Queen Consort. Behind them, James could hear the rapid footsteps of his colleagues approaching, their urgent whispers carrying down the corridor like approaching thunder. "Sir, you know we can't just interrupt His Majesty without proper appointment protocols," Guard Davies said nervously, his hand unconsciously moving toward his radio. "Especially not when there are conflicting orders about the princess's whereabouts." But James could see uncertainty in the man's eyes, the same moral conflict that had been tearing at his own conscience since Camilla had issued her incomprehensible order. Princess Charlotte lifted her head from James's shoulder and looked directly at the guards blocking their path. "Please," she said in her clear, young voice that carried surprising authority despite her age, "I really need to see my papa. I'm scared and confused, and I just want to go home." The simple dignity of her request seemed to cut through all the complicated protocols and procedures that governed palace life. Before anyone could respond, the heavy doors swung open from within, and King William himself appeared in the doorway. His face showed the strain of recent months, the weight of new responsibilities that had aged him beyond his years, but when he saw his daughter in James's arms, his expression immediately shifted to one of fierce paternal concern. James felt relief flood through him at the sight of the king's genuine worry for his child.
"Charlotte? What's happening here?"
William's voice carried both confusion and growing alarm as he took in the scene before him. His daughter being carried by a guard, multiple protection officers gathered in obvious tension, the unmistakable atmosphere of crisis that seemed to crackle in the air around them.
"Captain Harrison, why is my daughter not in her usual quarters?"
James gently set Charlotte down, but she immediately moved to stand close beside him, her small hand gripping his uniform jacket as if he were her anchor in a stormy sea. The gesture was not lost on William, who noticed the protective way his daughter positioned herself near the guard who had clearly become her champion. James straightened to attention, knowing that the next words out of his mouth would determine not just his own fate, but possibly the future of the royal family itself. "Your Majesty," James began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal, "I have been ordered by Queen Camilla to detain Princess Charlotte in the east wing of the palace indefinitely. The princess was to be confined to those quarters with no visitors and no freedom to leave until further notice from the queen consort personally." The words fell into the corridor like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that seemed to touch everyone present. William's face went through a series of emotions so rapidly that James could barely track them all.
Confusion gave way to disbelief, which transformed into something approaching fury before settling into a cold, controlled anger that was somehow more frightening than any explosion would have been.
The king's eyes, so similar to his daughter's, hardened into something that reminded James why this man was descended from warriors and conquerors.
"On what grounds?"
William's voice was deceptively quiet, but James could hear the dangerous undercurrent running beneath the surface calm.
"What possible justification could there be for confining my daughter like a prisoner in her own home?"
Charlotte pressed closer to James, instinctively recognizing the controlled rage in her father's voice even if she didn't fully understand its source. The queen consort mentioned concerns about the princess's welfare and certain influences that might not be in her best interest. James replied carefully, knowing that every word he spoke was potentially explosive. She indicated that this was a protective measure, but when I asked Princess Charlotte if she felt unsafe in any way, particularly with regard to your Majesty, she expressed only love and trust for you and confusion about why she was being separated from her family. William's attention shifted to his daughter, his expression softening immediately as he knelt down to her level. "Charlotte, sweetheart, tell Papa exactly what happened today. Don't worry about being polite or proper, just tell me the truth."
His voice carried all the warmth and security that every child deserved to hear from their father, and James felt his chest tighten with emotion at the obvious bond between them. "Papa, I was reading in the library about horses, and then Captain Harrison and the other guards came to take me to the East Wing," Charlotte began, her words tumbling out in a rush now that she finally had her father's full attention. "Camilla told me it was for my safety, but I don't understand what I need to be safe from. Captain Harrison asked me if I was afraid of you, but that's silly because you would never hurt me or George or Louis. You're the best papa in the whole world." The simple faith in Charlotte's voice seemed to strengthen William's resolve, and James watched as the king's jaw set in a way that suggested momentous decisions were being made. William reached out and gently cupped his daughter's face in his hands, his touch infinitely tender despite the storm brewing in his eyes. "Charlotte, I need you to understand something very important," William said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "No one, and I mean no one, has the authority to separate you from your family without my explicit permission. You are my daughter, and I am your father and your king, and those two facts together mean that you are under my protection always." The formal declaration rang through the corridor like a royal proclamation, and James felt the historical significance of the moment settling around them all. Behind them, Guard Thompson finally found his voice. Your Majesty, with respect, Queen Camilla's orders were very specific.
She emphasized the urgency of the situation and the need for immediate compliance. But his words sounded hollow and uncertain, especially in the face of William's obvious paternal authority and moral outrage. William stood slowly, his full height and bearing suddenly, reminding everyone present that they were in the presence of not just a concerned father, but a sovereign who commanded ultimate authority within his realm. "Captain Harrison," he said, his voice carrying new formality, "you mentioned that you questioned this order.
What specifically prompted your concerns?" James felt the weight of history pressing down on him as he prepared to answer. Everything he said now would be recorded, analyzed, and remembered by future generations studying this moment in royal history. But, looking at Princess Charlotte's trusting face and remembering the fear in her eyes when she had first seen the guards coming for her, James knew that truth was more important than political consequences. "Your Majesty, in my 15 years of service to your family, I have learned to recognize genuine threats versus manufactured ones," James said carefully. Princess Charlotte showed no signs of being influenced by anything harmful. She spoke with love and respect about both you and Princess Catherine. Her understanding of royal duty, as taught by her mother, seemed to center around compassion and service to others less fortunate. When asked what she wanted most, she simply wanted to come home to her family and continue her normal life with her brothers. The mention of Catherine seemed to crystallize something in William's understanding, and James saw recognition dawn in the king's eyes. The pieces of a larger puzzle were clearly falling into place, and the picture they revealed was apparently not a pleasant one. William's protective instincts as both a father and a husband seemed to sharpen into something that would not be easily deflected or ignored. "And you felt that these influences warranted imprisonment?" William asked, but the question was clearly rhetorical. "You believed that a child who loves her family and wants to help others needed to be isolated from those very family members who taught her these values?" The absurdity of the situation was becoming more apparent with each word, and James could see that William was building toward a confrontation that would reshape the power dynamics within the royal household. Charlotte tugged gently on her father's sleeve, drawing his attention back to her upturned face. "Papa, does this mean I don't have to go to the scary rooms by myself? Can I go back to my regular room and have dinner with George and Louis tonight?" The innocent hope in her voice reminded everyone present what was really at stake in this adult power struggle: the welfare and happiness of children who had done nothing to deserve being caught in the middle of political machinations. "You're not going anywhere except exactly where you want to be," William assured her, lifting her into his arms with the easy strength of a father accustomed to carrying his children. "But, first, Papa needs to have a very serious conversation with Camilla about boundaries and authority and who exactly makes decisions about my children's welfare." The quiet menace in his voice made it clear that this conversation would not be a pleasant one for the Queen Consort. James felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as he watched this family reunion unfold. His gamble had paid off in terms of reuniting Charlotte with her father, but he knew that the reverberations of his actions would continue to spread throughout the palace hierarchy. By choosing a child's welfare over blind obedience to authority, he had challenged the very foundations of how power operated within the royal system. "Captain Harrison," William said, his attention turning back to the guard who had risked everything to protect his daughter, "walk with us to the family quarters. I believe we have more to discuss about how my children's security will be handled going forward." The invitation was clearly more than just a request, it was a recognition of James's actions and possibly a preview of significant changes to come in how the royal household would operate. The walk to the family quarters felt like a journey through a transformed palace. Word of the confrontation had spread with the supernatural speed that characterized all royal gossip, and James could feel eyes watching from doorways and corners as they passed. Staff members who had been going about their daily duties now stood in small clusters, whispering urgently among themselves. The very air seemed charged with anticipation, as if everyone in the palace understood that something fundamental was shifting in the balance of power. Princess Charlotte walked between her father and James, her small hand holding tightly to each of theirs in a gesture that spoke volumes about where her trust and loyalty lay. William's stride was purposeful and determined, each step carrying them closer to what James suspected would be the most significant confrontation in recent royal history. The king's face had settled into an expression of controlled fury that James had never seen before, and he found himself both grateful to be on William's side and slightly concerned about what was coming next. As they approached the family wing of the palace, they encountered Prince George and Prince Louis playing in one of the comfortable sitting rooms under the watchful eye of their nanny. Both boys looked up as their father and sister entered, and James could see immediate concern cross their young faces as they registered the unusual tension in the air. Children, James reflected, were often more perceptive about adult emotions than adults gave them credit for. "Papa, is Charlotte okay?" Prince George asked with the protective instinct of an older brother who had learned to watch out for his younger siblings. "She looks sad, and there are lots of people talking in whispers today." His observation confirmed what James had suspected, that the atmosphere of crisis had permeated throughout the palace, affecting even the youngest members of the royal family. William set Charlotte down gently and gathered all three of his children close to him, his expression softening as he focused on reassuring them. "Everything is fine now," he told them, his voice carrying the absolute certainty that children needed to hear from their parents during confusing times. There was a misunderstanding about where Charlotte was supposed to be today, but Captain Harrison helped sort everything out. The simplification was necessary for young minds, but James could see the gratitude in William's eyes as he acknowledged his role in resolving the crisis. "Can we have tea together like always?" Charlotte asked hopefully, her voice carrying the resilience that seemed characteristic of all three children. "And can we call Mama so she knows I'm safe?" The innocent request hit James like a physical blow as he realized how thoroughly Camilla's plan would have separated this child not just from her father, but from all the normal touchstones of her life. "Of course, sweetheart," William replied, but James could see the wheels turning in the king's mind as he processed the implications of Charlotte's words. If Catherine was indeed away on royal duties, she would have no way of knowing what had nearly happened to her daughter unless someone specifically told her. The thought of what might have transpired if James hadn't intervened, of Charlotte simply disappearing from normal family life without explanation, seemed to fuel William's growing anger. The tranquil family scene was suddenly interrupted by the rapid approach of footsteps in the corridor outside. James recognized the distinctive click of expensive heels on marble floors, and he felt his muscles tense automatically as Queen Camilla appeared in the doorway. Her face was flushed with what appeared to be equal parts exertion and fury, and her usually perfect composure had cracked to reveal something much less regal underneath. "William," she began without preamble, her voice tight with barely controlled anger, "there seems to have been a serious breach of protocol regarding security arrangements I personally authorized. Princess Charlotte was supposed to be secured in the East Wing, and instead I find her here as if nothing has happened." Her eyes swept across the room, taking in the cozy family scene with obvious displeasure. William stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled in a way that suggested he was fighting to maintain his temper in front of his children. James instinctively moved slightly closer to the children, his protective instincts engaging as he sensed the confrontation that was about to unfold. The three young royals seemed to sense the tension as well, drawing closer together in the way children do when adults begin to argue. "Camilla," William replied, his voice carrying a dangerous quiet that made James's skin prickle with anticipation, "perhaps you could explain to me exactly what authority you believe you have to issue security orders regarding my children without consulting me." The question was deceptively simple, but it cut straight to the heart of the constitutional crisis that had been building beneath the surface of royal family life. "I am Queen Consort," Camilla replied, drawing herself up to her full height and clearly expecting that title to end all discussion. "I have responsibilities to this family and this institution that sometimes require difficult decisions." Charlotte's exposure to certain ideologies was becoming problematic, and intervention was necessary. Her words carried the tone of someone who had convinced herself that her actions were not only justified but praiseworthy. James felt Charlotte press closer to him as her step-grandmother spoke, and he could see confusion and hurt in the child's eyes. The word ideology seemed particularly cruel when applied to an 8-year-old girl whose greatest crime appeared to be loving her mother and wanting to help people in need. The absurdity of treating childhood compassion as a dangerous influence would have been laughable if it weren't so genuinely harmful. "What ideologies?" William asked, his voice dropping even lower. "The ideology that members of the royal family should show compassion for those less fortunate? The ideology that we should use our privileges to help others rather than simply enjoying them? The ideology that my wife has spent years demonstrating through her charitable work?"
Each question hit like a carefully aimed arrow, and James could see Camilla's confidence beginning to waver. Catherine fills the children's heads with unrealistic expectations about their roles, Camilla responded, but her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty.
She encourages them to see themselves as social workers rather than royals.
Such thinking undermines the dignity and distance necessary for the monarchy to maintain its authority. The words revealed so much about Camilla's worldview that James felt stunned by their implications. Prince George, despite his young age, seemed to understand enough of the conversation to respond. "But Mama says helping people is what makes being royal special," he said in his clear young voice. "She says we get to live in a palace so we can invite people who need help and make their lives better." The innocent wisdom of his words seemed to highlight the moral bankruptcy of Camilla's position. William's expression had grown increasingly thunderous as the conversation progressed, and